Hi, welcome to Arts Alive. This is Yamhill County's art program. I am your host, Emily Grosvenor, and I am so excited to be here today with author, poet, and musician Bethany Lee. Welcome, Bethany.
Thank you.
Bethany, last year you had your first book of poetry come out in May, The Breath Between.
Mm-hmm.
And do you want to hold it up just for a second
Sure.
so we can see
Yeah.
it? So for Oregonians, this cover has got to evoke a lot of really wonderful feelings. It's just gorgeous. I was wondering if we could start with just having you read a poem from the collection.
This one feels appropriate to the season. Notice joy, the way your heart lifts in your chest with hope at the robin's return. Perhaps this is what the wishbone is for. Allow space for the pang, the hand around the heart at the sight of a purpled leaf, a beauty too extravagant. This is how you can know you are one of humanity. Build your tolerance for what astounds you. Be amazed, even if kneeling on holy ground means risking the thorns in your bared soul. Do not fear the pain of being wide awake to glory. Hear now the chickadee call. Watch the fog lift from the lake. There it is, in your own breath, sustenance and mystery.
Wow, that's just lovely. Feels a little bit like almost like a pep talk.
Oh, I hope that many of the poems are something that bring people hope and courage.
So where do you see that poem fitting within the larger collection? I know you have it separated and structured into 5 different sections, almost like a symphony.
Almost like.
Mm-hmm.
That was really fun. I had heard so many authors talk about write the product and sometimes a format will emerge. And I thought, I don't really have an idea for any sort of specific format. I'm going to go ahead and see if they're right. And a day or so before I sent the manuscript in, I was reading through it one last time and sections started to emerge. And so as I looked at that and they fell into just about even lengths, I started to notice that the first section was like an introduction, and the second section was an andante, which in music means walking pace. Mm-hmm. And there were poems about going for a walk and poems about being on the move. And there's an allegro, which is quick and happy, and a largo, which is a little bit slower. And maybe some of the more difficult pieces or some of the sadder pieces are in that section. And of course, the end is the finale. So it was really fun to have that fall into place. To be able to bring my experience as a musician to my life as a writer and poet as well.
So as a reader, what I love about that is it's almost like you're giving people a way to, you're not really prescribing what they're going to feel when they read it, but if they want to come if I want to open your book and say, okay, I want to feel this way today, you can choose that based on the structure.
Yeah.
That's really cool. So it sounds like it was something that just emerged naturally.
As
it wasn't
part of the
imposed
process.
on it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I find that fascinating. I think that is pretty common among the arts, that sometimes something will emerge that you didn't intend when you first began in a painting or in a sculpture or something like that. It's fun to see that happen in poetry.
What was the day like when you discovered that?
Oh, it's always a mix for me of I think this thing is emerging. I think this is what this wants to be. And then there's the immediate self-doubt of are you sure? Are you sure that's what it wants to be? But I've learned to sit with that a little bit. Sometimes it helps to put something in a drawer. I have a couple of really great first readers who I send things to. Are you getting the same sense that I am from this piece? this ending feels like it's falling into place. Does it feel the same to you? And they've been great about helping give me some feedback, honest feedback. If it's not working for them, they'll say so. And usually I'm like, that was the part I didn't think was working. And so I go back to the drawing board. But having that kind of helpful community has helped me to learn when I get the sense that it's really truly starting to become what it wants to be. I trust that better with the help of my friends.
How did you find those people?
Some of them are in a writers group. I write with a group of women in Portland, and I found those through a drop-in workshop through PDX Writers, which is an amazing community of writers. All of their drop-in workshops are prompt workshops, and so everybody's working with really fresh writing, and I love that the community is very intentional about only offering feedback about what's strong, what's working really well, what is impacting them, figuring the author can go home and cut what's not working and fix the awkward grammar that maybe they noticed just as well as you did. But to be able to hear over and over again, this is what's working, this is what's strong, this is where the truth is really coming through from you. You start to be able to go to that place a little bit more easily and more often.
Right. I mean, poets necessarily have to have pretty tender hearts, so they have to find a process that makes sense.
I think some writers do really well with someone who tears their work to shreds and sends them home to build it back up again. But I would never have continued writing with that process.
Right.
And I, like you say, I think I used to think that maybe I needed a thicker skin, but the thin skin is part of the benefit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You need to be exactly who you are. I always said that I had teachers that were the carrot and teachers that were the stick.
Sure.
And I really appreciate both. And I actually need them both. Sometimes I need the stick a little bit more.
We're all different, but I think it's so great to find who you are by doing the process, and then you learn and you refine the process. And I think any artist who isn't also interested in the process of art making is missing out. There's so much. That's the fun of it.
So I think that there is a step, though, that many people write poetry, but not everyone has said, I'm going to publish a book of poetry. So where did that desire come from for you?
That feels like something that was just intuitive. I had been writing for probably about 10 or 12 years. And I started to notice that I had a few more and more poems piling up in my on my hard drive. And I talked to a friend who works for a publishing company and just said, I'm starting to feel like it might be time to share these. For a long time, when I was first getting into writing, I didn't want to go into it to write a book. Right. I wanted to do it for my own sake. I wanted to see what I might learn about myself through the process of putting words on paper. And that was a huge, huge benefit to me. But one day I was talking to a friend of mine about it. I said, I write for myself. I don't write to become a famous author. Anyone who wants to write because they want to be a rich author is going to be very disappointed. So I felt like I got really clear about why I was doing it and that it was something I wanted to do for my own sake. And she said, well, that's really great, Bethany, but please remember, some of us want to read what you have to say. And that was a helpful balance to hear, that that my words could be useful for someone else, could be a pep talk, or could bring joy and beauty to someone's life who needs that just as much as we need food and air. Right. So it takes a different kind of courage to shift from the courage it takes to write really honestly for yourself to the courage it takes to share some of that out into the world. But I've had a lot of help. I've had encouraging editors and, like I say, other writers and first readers. But I think a lot of that came from the 10 or 12 years before of writing for myself. You develop a community that's there when things are shifting, and the
Yeah,
flow is going outward.
it's interesting. People always talk about film as the art form that involves many people and many voices,
sure,
but
yeah.
books are the same way.
Yeah, only one name ends up on the
Right.
on the cover usually, but there's a long acknowledgement section.
Exactly.
Yes.
That's one of my favorite things to read, actually.
Oh, me too. But it was horrifying to write. It was really scary to write.
Am I in there? No,
I
just
was
kidding.
afraid I was going to forget someone who was going to get their feelings hurt,
Right.
or someone who, even the most important people in your life sometimes slip your mind when you're trying to make a list.
Oh, exactly.
People forget, at the Oscars, forget to thank their spouse or
Oh
something
my gosh,
horrifying
that's
like
the
that.
one, isn't
Yeah.
it? The one that stands out.
Right.
So, do you remember your first encounters with poetry?
I think I first started reading as an adult in my 20s. I know I wrote some poetry as a kid. My dad recently uncovered something I'd written at 11. I was not a precocious writer, let's just say. I wrote a lot of things
What was
as
that
a
poem
kid.
about?
It was an acrostic poem about someone who I worked with. As a musician, I worked even as a pretty young person doing some music in various nursing homes. And the person who I went with to those, I was writing a fond poem about him. It was very sweet.
Very sweet.
But as a young adult, I found an entrance into poetry in anthologies. I'd read a few things that really hit me the way a good poem does. But what makes a poem good for me is different from what might make a poem good for someone else. And so I loved finding some anthologies that had just so many different ones. If I didn't like one, I could turn the page. And I found some favorite authors that way. I would really recommend that. If someone thinks, I hear people talk about poetry, but I've just never connected with any,
Right.
anthologies are great ways to start.
That's a great idea. So, what makes a good poem for you?
I think for me, I want something that's pretty accessible. I want something that I can understand. I don't want a poem where I feel like the author is trying to make me feel stupid because they know so much more than I do. And a form that is something I can enter into, whether it's free verse or blank verse, or whether there's some sort of meter. I want something that seems accessible on the page. I want something that that it takes me to a moment, or maybe gives me the opportunity to bring my own emotion to what is happening on the page. I think some of my favorite work of my own are things where there's space for someone else to have an experience with the work that I didn't intend, and there's room for someone to have their own emotion about that. I think any book, a novel or any book, is an interaction between the author and the reader. But poetry especially, I think if it's really going to sink deep into the reader, it's got to be something where the author has said, here's how the world seems to me today. And the reader can pick that up and say, yes, I see this too. The world seems that way to me too.
So it sounds like you're really intentional about the reader's experience.
Yeah, it's a strange combination between writing for myself for so long and also wanting to make sure that that I write for a hypothetical reader, that it's not so off-putting or so personal. I think there's a difference between writing a personal poem and writing a poem that's really particular. And when I write something that's very particular to my own experience, often I find that there's the universal that's held inside of that. But sometimes things feel like they're very personal, and then I don't usually share those.
Yeah, it's a tricky thing. I know. At this point, I only write poetry to my husband. And the imagery that I use is so specific, and it is meant for only two people.
Just an
and that
audience
is
of
part
one.
of what makes it a love poem.
Yeah.
Is having that shared
Yeah.
language.
And sometimes people choose to let that kind of piece out into the world, and then we get to eavesdrop. But that's a different experience than a poem that is written and offered for you.
Exactly.
You know, I like those too.
So do you think there's a connection? I always think that people tend to have not necessarily a single way, but a really strong, salient way that they're operating in the world. And to me, it sounds like with the poetry, with crafting these experiences for readers, and also with your musical career, that you are almost fascinated by that process of shaping people's experiences or giving them an experience.
I think that's true. It's fun to have an opportunity to think out loud about that with you, because I have done music most of my life, and that's definitely an opportunity that you have to be in a space with someone who's letting you shape an experience for them. Whether it's a brief experience, I've played in hospital lobbies and I shape the 10 seconds as someone walks by. Or I did a backyard concert series last summer and brought harp and a friend who played the cello, and people sat out on their blankets and ate their picnics and drank their wine, and I got to be a part of shaping that whole evening for them and giving people an opportunity to be really present in the moment. I think that's something that music can offer us, is the opportunity to come really present to what's happening right here and now. And I'd like to think that there's a thread between my music and my poetry in that sense.
There has to be, because your poems have so much about noticing the moment. So it's like provide the moment, but also notice the moment.
Yeah. The invitation to notice, and then the tools to do it. You know.
So one thing that fascinates me is for a while you were volunteering as a musician who spends time performing for people who are taking their final breaths. Can you talk a little bit about what that was like?
Yeah. So I did some training a few years back. It's a 2-year program, Music for Healing and Transition. And those words have come to mean more and more for me. The idea of healing is something that etymologically is from the same root as whole, is from the same root as holy, and is something we can always be moving toward. We think sometimes we confuse healing with cure. And so at the end of life, it doesn't seem like there's a cure for what's happening for someone we love or for us when it's our turn. But there can always be a movement toward wholeness. And there's always a chance for music to ease the transitions in our life. It's not just a euphemism for the biggest transition at the end of our life. So it's something that I had been thinking about for a long time, and thinking that might be on my list of things to do when my kids got old enough. My kids are 18 and 20 now, and so it makes it a lot easier to do some of these things. So a few years back, I went back to school and did this program, and I love being able to have that gift to offer. It's a gift for me to be in that space with someone at the very end of their life, to be one of the last people someone interacts with or someone ever sees. I'm getting
chills just thinking about it. I mean, it's such a profound moment and
it
a
is
profound space.
Such a profound space, and to be a part of that is a gift to me, as well as it feels like a gift to be able to offer an action in a time when a lot of people feel pretty helpless.
Right.
There's not a whole lot that needs to be done if you are there to accompany someone at the end of their life. But accompanying can be very uncomfortable. We don't always know how to be with someone who's in pain or with someone in an uncertain place. And I'd like to think that that's a gift I can help offer, and that music can help family members feel a little less uncertain about what to do. You know, in times when I'm playing for a patient who has family there, often the family will be holding a long vigil, and they might be in a chair across the room, which of course, it's a long time. You're not going to stand by the bed for hours and hours. But when the music starts, they gather around, and it gives everyone an opportunity to, again, come really present to what's happening, and to have something to do with each other for a little while. Sometimes the music buffers the pain that people are feeling, and sometimes it finally supports them in the ability to let that out. So sometimes people who needed to have a cry will feel like it's finally safe enough to do that if there's music there. I mean, we all experience that. How many of us listened to angsty music all through middle school to say for us what we couldn't say with our lack of ability to talk about our emotions? And it can be a help at any stage of life. It feels like a really precious thing to be able to have.
I like the idea of it being an invitation to open the room to emotion and to let that happen. We think of emotions like happening to us, like I was
Sure.
was angry,
Yeah.
I was this, but those things reside inside of our body, so it's almost like opening a little pressure
Yeah.
valve for some people.
Yeah.
Wow, that's so amazing. Are there certain types of music that lend themselves well?
Yeah, absolutely. And also certain types that aren't the greatest. It's something that we do a lot of training about and try to get a wide repertoire. I have no idea when I walk into a room of a stranger what sort of feelings or experiences, memories they might have with any particular song. So sometimes it's helpful, especially at the very end of life, to play something that's unfamiliar. And other times people, if they're feeling well, or I have played for people in all stages of life in the healthcare facilities. And so maybe someone is just getting ready to go home from a surgery and they're feeling great and they just want to hear some Beatles. So it's fun to try to find all sorts of different things to arrange for the harp so I can have a bunch in my back pocket ready to pull out.
Right. Let's not forget that transitions can happen throughout your life.
Yes, and be joyful as
Right.
well as difficult. Yeah.
Right. And I like the idea that you're accompanying the person.
For a long time, on my business card, my title was just accompanist because I work part-time as a choral accompanist, but also it felt like the best possible name for what I do, whether it's in some of the spiritual companioning that I do, or in my work as a harpist in healthcare, or even in my writing. I'd like to be able to accompany you. My publisher for the poetry book says that he feels like poetry specifically, but all of art, helps us to take each other's hands and walk together into the mystery. And that's the kind of accompanying that I like to be able to do.
So did I hear that you just sent off pages for a new book?
I did. Right before I left the house,
Wonderful.
I got up the guts. You know, when you have a deadline, sometimes it's helpful not to overthink it. And I thought, I have 10 minutes. I'm just going to send this off and we'll fix any mistakes we find later. So yeah, there's another book. It also has some musical ideas in it. It's called Etude for Belonging. And that'll come out later this year or early next year.
So what else can you tell us about it, about the poems?
Well, so I really love the idea of an etude. In music, it is a piece that someone has written to help a musician practice something difficult in the context of an actual song. So you could play all the scales you want, but until you're trying to play those scales inside a piece of music, it's always going to be difficult to make that transfer. So the title piece, Etude for Belonging, is my gift to help us all. It's tough to practice belonging in the world. We can struggle so much feeling like we don't belong in our space. Maybe we struggle with thinking we don't belong in our workplace, or we just got a new promotion and we don't feel like we belong. And sometimes on the really hard days, we can even feel like we don't belong with our friends, or we don't belong in our own bodies. And so I hope that both that piece specifically and many of the other ones offer people a chance to do this practice of belonging, of finding courage and hope. As I've gone through the final editing process, it was amazing to me how many times these poems talk about courage. And I think It's what I need right now, so I wrote it for myself, assuming other people are going to need that too.
I love that. Now I'm thinking, what else can you apply etudes to?
Right? Right? We do
What
that
if
so
every
often.
day is an etude?
What if every day is an etude?
Right.
An
What if-
opportunity to practice who we want to be in this specific day.
That's so fascinating. I love the crossover that you're bringing between music and poetry, because there's a natural affinity there, but perhaps not in the way that you're currently exploring.
Yeah. I have started writing more songs again and just joined a small songwriting circle. So it's been fun to feel a little like I'm sorting sometimes. Oh, I think you actually are not a line of poetry. I think you are the beginning of a piece of music and want to be a song lyric instead. But every once in a while I have something that wants to be both. So I have a couple pieces that are pieces of poetry, but that also made their way into a piece of music. So it's really fun to have a toe in several different pieces of the art world, to let those kind of commingle and see what emerges from all of that.
Right, and then you can take away the title. I don't have to call you a poet, or
Right.
I don't want to overcomplicate things here, but you're a very busy woman, and you also are on contract, I know, for a memoir.
Yes, that just went off a few weeks ago.
So the book, you sent the book off? Oh.
Yeah. So the rough draft is finished, and we're getting ready to do a bunch of rewrites and edits. It's about the year that my family spent at sea. When my daughters were in middle school, we spent a year traveling by small sailboat down the coast of the U.S. To Mexico and back. And again, there's so much crossover. So many of the pieces of poetry talk about what it's like to be uncertain, to not know necessarily where you're going, and to try that anyway. And music in healthcare settings is all about being in the present moment, whether
Right.
you're uncertain about what's happening and moving forward. And if learning to sail the Pacific isn't a good metaphor for that, I don't know what is.
It certainly sounds like it. I know. So since the book's finished, how have you structured it? With memoir, I'm always curious about structure, because
Sure.
that seems like that is the work of memoirs, how to structure.
You know, this one feels pretty easy because the voyage had a beginning, a middle, and an end. There were disasters along the way, and there were storms that we sailed through, and so it feels like I did the hard work of living it, and now the work of structuring it is much easier because I just need to write what happened. So this is just, at the moment, unless something changes, it's just a purely chronological story about that year. And of course, it's not just about that year. You know, you can't write about going to sea without doing a little exploration about what it feels like to leave home, come home, make a home inside you, what it feels like to be in a storm, what it feels like to come back from disaster. All of those things are going to happen in any of our lives, and I felt like it was such a privilege to get to live that out. Maybe it makes me a terrible poet, or maybe it makes me a great poet, that often I need to live the actual thing before I can talk about it as metaphor. And so I'm really grateful to have had the chance. I tease my husband. I say I'm terrible at writing fiction. I write hackneyed, horrible fiction when I try, but he helped give me a life worth writing some nonfiction about.
Oh, that's such a lovely sentiment. And what's the book called?
It doesn't have a title yet, so suggestions accepted.
I do love titling books. And subtitles. Does it have a subtitle?
It doesn't. Subtitles are tough.
My year of sailing with my family.
Right.
Something along that.
It'll be fun. It'll be fun to see. It was so exciting to see the title and subtitle come together for this one. And my cover designer is just an amazing, amazing woman. And so I'm really excited to see what she does with the next book of poetry. And I don't know yet. It's possible she'll do the cover design for the memoir as well.
So when you look back on that experience, what do you think is your strongest takeaway?
You know, I have alluded to this a little bit. I feel like I learned to my bones how to be in uncertainty. And that doesn't mean it's easy now, but I do feel like I have a familiar chart for unfamiliar times. And that, if we are awake enough to our own life, we're going to be aware that it's always uncertain. And if we are not awake to our own life because we're too afraid to brave the uncertainty, we're going to miss it. So that's something that has felt like a huge gift to be able to bring back.
Well, I'm so happy for you and so excited to see these books coming out. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's been my complete pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.